Most fungal hyphae are strictly for absorbing nutrients from their surroundings. However, there are some specialized hyphae that perform specific activities, and what you're seeing on this slide is an example of hyphae being used for predation. So here we have a fungi that's actually a predator. So what this one does is it captures small animals in the environment, and once it has them captured or trapped, then it's able to secrete the digestive enzymes, and it digests that small animal and absorbs the nutrients inside. So it forms little loops that are going to tangle up the nematode in this case so that it can be digested. So you have a couple different pictures on this slide showing that tangling up in the hyphae of a small nematode. Now, we can also have specialized hyphae that are used to absorb nutrients from some other cell type. In this picture, we have what's called Historia. Historia are used to penetrate a cell wall, and this would be a plant cell wall, and then once inside, they spread out so that they're able to absorb nutrition. Now, this can be parasitic. It could also be a mutualistic relationship. Just depends on the organisms that are involved in it. As you can see in this picture on the right-hand side, we have some plant cells, and then we can see the hyphae over the top, and inside we can see all of those Historia. So these Historia are branched networks that are inside the cell that have a very large surface area. So they're going to be very good at absorbing nutrients from that specific cell that they're inserted into. If we look at another case of specialized hyphae, these are what we call mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are associations with plant roots. So this is fungi, and they are with plants. And this is a symbiotic relationship. So this is going to be mutually beneficial for both the fungi and the plants. And most plant roots we do find associated with some mycorrhizal fungi. The reason for this is that the fungi have a very large surface area on their own, and then the plant roots have a large surface area. But if we put the two together, they can both provide some benefits for each other. So the plant tends to provide carbohydrates because the plant is up above the Earth's surface. It is photosynthesizing and making sugars, and then it can transport those down to the root so that it can transmit that to the fungi. And then what the fungi is providing in this relationship is usually some phosphate ions, maybe some nitrogen, but some other nutrients that it's finding in the soil. Fungi are very good at absorbing those things, so it does the absorbing with its large surface area and transmits that to the plant cells. Now we can have two different types of fungi that are performing this mycorrhizae relationship. The ones that you see in the top picture, this is what we call ectomycorrhizae. And we call it ecto because ecto means outside. And in this picture, this larger structure would be the root, and then all of these little hairs, those are the mycorrhizae. They stay on the outside. They're not going to penetrate the cell wall of the plant. They may penetrate the extracellular spaces of the plant cells just a little bit, but they do stay on the outside. In the bottom picture, we see what's called arbuscular mycorrhizae. And with these, they do penetrate. So this one does penetrate. And if you look at this picture, this would be hyphae. And we can see right here that it actually pushes through the cell wall of the plant and extends inside. There's not one type of mycorrhizae that's better than the other. They are both performing symbiotic relationships. So they would be providing benefits to the plant cells. The plant cells would be providing benefits back to them. Now, another thing to point out is that most fungi are known for spore production. These spores can be asexually produced or they can be sexually produced. So we will have examples of both. And most of the fungi are classified according to their sexual reproduction. So according to their structures that actually do produce the spores. We tend to get huge quantities of spores produced, as you see in this picture here. And those spores, they're very tiny and they can be carried very long distances by wind and water. So we're getting lots of offspring potential produced here if they land in good locations for germination. There are fungal spores all around us. There's lots of them just in the typical atmosphere. You've probably seen something like you're seeing in this picture on the bottom of the slide. You have some fresh fruit, it looks fine, you think it's clean, and then you may notice some mold growing on it. Or perhaps you have some bread that you've even left inside of a bag, closed up and sealed on your counter, or even in your fridge for that matter, and you may end up with mold on it. Well, that mold came from fungal spores, which were in the air, and they happened to germinate because conditions were favorable for that. So just be aware that fungi produce spores. They produce a lot of spores, and those spores carry very easy in wind and water. So you're not really going to find many places where you don't have some fungal spores present. Here we're going to take a look at a typical fungal life cycle. They have asexual reproduction, and many of them also have sexual reproduction. If we're talking about asexual reproduction, we want to start off with just a mycelium. So by mycelium, we're talking about a network of hyphae. This could be septate hyphae or it could be cenocytic hyphae, and that would really just depend on the specific species that we were looking at the moment. These mycelium tend to grow until they exhaust the nutrients in a given environment. If they exhaust the nutrients that they have available to them, then they tend to reproduce. When they reproduce, they produce spore-producing structures. These are called sporangia. And those sporangia will produce spores. Those spores, if they land in a good location, then they will germinate, and that will produce more mycelium, more hyphae networks. Now, this is asexual reproduction, so that is going to produce clones. So those spores will germinate and they will produce a network that is identical genetically to the parent mycelium that they came from. Now, another important thing to note about fungal life cycles is that they are going to be by far primarily haploid. We usually only have 1 or 2 small cells that will be diploid. Most of the time, we are going to see our fungi present as haploid structures. If we look here at the sexual reproduction side of all of it, with sexual reproduction, usually you need to have 2 different sexually compatible strains. If you have 2 sexually compatible strains, then we can have sexual reproduction take place. When this happens, there's usually chemicals that are involved, and these chemicals are going to be called pheromones. And these pheromones help the fungi to recognize that you are dealing with 2 sexually compatible strains. So when they come together, they will fuse. So plasmogamy is fusion, and this is going to be of the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasms will fuse, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the nuclei are going to fuse. So a lot of times that is something that will take place a little bit down the road. So when we get the plasmogamy, you end up with cells that may actually have 2 nuclei inside of them. That's what we call heterokaryotic. So these not only have 2 nuclei in them, but these are 2 genetically different nuclei because these came from 2 different mycelium. That fungi may exist in that heterokaryotic stage for a little while, and then eventually we do get karyogamy. In karyogamy, this would be the part that is fusion of the nuclei. So when you get the fusion of the nuclei, you're going to take a haploid cell or a haploid nuclei and another haploid nuclei, fuse them together, so now we end up with the zygote, which is going to be diploid. That usually is the only diploid stage that we'll be dealing with when we're talking about fungi. That zygote tends to immediately undergo meiosis, and since we then undergo meiosis, we're going to produce spores, which will be haploid. Now in this case, because it is meiosis that's giving rise to the spores, these spores will be genetically different from each other, also from the parent strains that they came from, and they will be dispersed. And if they land in a good location, then they will germinate into their own mycelium. So that's just a look at the typical life cycles for fungi. We have asexual life cycles, and then we also have sexual life cycles. For most fungi, they are classified based on their sexual life cycle. So as you saw from that generic life cycle, fungal hyphae and most spores do tend to be haploid. It is possible to get diploid cells produced during a fungal life cycle, but usually that's a very short-lived and transient stage. So if we're talking about the zygote tends to very quickly undergo meiosis to produce more haploid spores. It's also possible to have fungi that do not exist as mycelium, so fungi that don't have hyphae. Here's an example of that. This is yeast, and yeast tend to be present as just unicellular structures. So they're spherical structures. They don't reproduce by spores either. These tend to reproduce by budding. And we can see some of that budding right here where you just have them pinching apart into two cells. So this is pretty unusual for fungi, but there are some fungi that will reproduce by budding. Most fungi are going to be classified according to their sexual reproduction and what their sexual reproductive structures look like. If we have fungi that only reproduce asexually, it can be very difficult to classify those. So we do have one category which we call deuteromycetes, and this is for those. So these only reproduce asexually. And since they only reproduce asexually, we don't really know where to classify them. Now, if they are ever seen to reproduce sexually, then we can reclassify them in their appropriate group. But this is just kind of a generic category to throw any of those fungi into that we don't know what their sexual reproductive structures look like.